I first saw It Always Rains on Sunday about 20 years ago at the BFI in a season, and I knew it was an Ealing film, but I knew it wasn't an Ealing comedy.
I saw it on a Sunday afternoon on BBC One in my teens, I think. I'd never heard of it before, and it really knocked me out.
And it seems to me to offer a very singular vision of working class life in the immediate post-war period.
And just all these wonderful little details. Like Hermione Baddeley has one scene. She's the owner of this doss house, the police questioner, and she walks off screen, and as she does, she scratches her behind, and it's a lovely little touch.
It's my duty to warn you that if you're harbouring this man...
I know. I'll be rendering myself liable to a term of imprisonment not exceeding 2 years. I still ain't seen him, and I'm going back to bed.
Good night.
It Always Rains on Sundays is an interesting film. You could say it marks a kind of turning point in Ealing, because up to that point, Ealing had not been famous for making comedies. They'd made war films during the war. They'd made films about the home front. They were making quite gritty films, and of course it is quite a gritty film itself. Soon afterwards, Ealing would become known for its comedies, often black comedies, but comedies. And if you show It Always Rains on Sunday to someone, they think, Ealing? But didn't they make those really funny films? But in fact, it's a very serious film. I think if you were going to look for a sort of snapshot of the condition of England in the post-war period, you would be very hard-pressed to find any other film that did this.
Where it has authenticity, the film, is that it's largely shot on the streets, which is really unusual for the time. Douglas Slocum goes out there, who's a notable British cameraman who goes on to work with people like Joseph Losey later. But that sense of London, the street markets, the railways, the alleys by the docks, is what gives the film its real ingrained authenticity, and therefore it's convincing.
What it did, which is what you didn't see very often, was this little community with petty criminals hanging around and, like trying to sell skates that they've stolen. I mean, it's wonderful in that sense.
What have you brought this time? We've got a grocer, those. They sell at 15 bob a pair. Very nice. Very nice indeed. My skating days are over. Don't waste my time. I can't use stuff like that.
I think people would have recognised this community when a lot of films made in England were about middle class or upper class people who all talk like that, and were worried about dressing for dinner and that sort of nonsense. I mean, you look at, say, something like Blithe Spirit, and it's where this England is, God alone knows. They're living in this fabulous luxury. He appears to do no work at all and is deprived of both wives. We think, well, great, but who lives in that world? Nobody does. This was a recognisable world that ordinary people could see, and you could go into the East End and see that.
Though the Blitz spirit existed during the Blitz, it broke apart very, very quickly, and people became very private and individual quite quickly afterwards. And what you get in It Always Rains on Sunday is a woman who feels trapped in an environment.
What we really feel is the old East End community, which has its pluses. People are there to support you, but they're also nosy. They want to know what's going on. They're looking in all round.
Morning, Mrs. Sandygate.
Morning, Mrs. Watson.
Nice weather for ducks and aspidistras.
It's like a sort of CCTV generation where everything you see is being watched by people, and that the sense of community, which seems to be sort of celebratory in the East End with Petticoat Lane Market, it seems very comforting. Actually, it's quite threatening.
Well, I must go and get the dinner on.
What you got today?
Beef.
I got a nice bit of lamb, a mint sauce. I never think lamb's quite the same without mint sauce.
No, nor do I. Well, I really must go and get mine in the oven.
We see Rose as she is today, in the today of 1947, when it's always raining and life is a bit grim. I mean, this was the grimmest period of the post-war years. Britain was bankrupt. The weather was dreadful. There was terrible snow coming that winter. It really was a very, very tough time.
Just the way in which you first see they're both in bed, which was very, very risque. You didn't show men and women in bed together. She goes up to the window, she draws the curtains back, she says, "Raining." That sounds like a very, very simple act to do and say, but it's really not, to say one word. And there's all that boredom to come of a Sunday. I think it's wonderful in that, of capturing atmosphere.
Raining, it would.
People felt that, yes, we'd won the war, but what was there really to look forward to in daily life? So Rose belongs to that present, but she has a past.
She sort of represents that generation of women who used to drive ambulances or drive buses, or who were land girls or in the WAF or the Wrens. And now that the men have all come back from the war, all they're doing is being housewives. And all that Googie Withers can do is do the mending or make the Sunday dinner. And her only horizon is the back garden fence. She never goes out of the house.
We see from the beginning that there's a great lost moment in her life. This is a kind of passionate kind of woman who is then forced by circumstances into a rather drab and everyday marriage, which she's treating with a degree of responsibility. She doesn't want to just throw everything up, but she is someone living in a dream. So we're drawn into that. We sympathise with her. She's almost a person in colour in a black and white world.
Is wonderfully art directed. That wallpaper in the hall it's suffocating because it's floral and it's a tiny hall. Those interiors especially, I mean, they're all cramped, and they're cramped with all this stuff. Everywhere you look, there's stuff, ornaments, big bedclothes. And the fact that one of the bedroom doors sticks because it's damp. That's what's so fabulous. He creates atmosphere through interiors.
And so when John McCallum comes in to her environment and invades her environment, he's this sexy, exciting man who's escaped from prison. He's a Richard Hannay straight out of an adventure novel or an adventure film. And for her, that's a great romantic idea.
Don't answer it. Let him go.
I've got to answer it. I dare not answer it.
You heard what I said. Don't answer him.
I've got to answer it. They'll tumble the whole thing if I don't.
I guess that if you take the metaphor that Hamer's exploring his sexuality, he has got not a mad woman in the attic, but he's got a criminal trapped upstairs in the bedroom with a locked door, and you don't have to look very far psychologically to see how he's exploring his own position, I would say.
Robert Hamer is one of the most interesting Ealing directors. I would say he's one of the two most important, along with Alexander McKendrick. He made 5 films for Ealing, and he worked for Ealing for 8 years, so he was really one of the long-term figures there. And he's also one of the directors who's got a real reputation outside of Ealing. He's rated by people outside Britain, indeed, which is not so common, as a major director. The French surrealists, for instance, regarded him as a major figure. So he's someone who, I suppose, gave strength to Ealing, but at the same time rose above this sense of Ealing as just a kind of cosy family of filmmakers.
Googie Withers in the film does 2 radical things. She clearly sleeps with her ex-boyfriend in her husband's bed, which is a very radical thing for a woman to do at all in 1947, let alone in a popular film. And she tries to kill herself. So these 2 things, this ordinary woman, she commits 2 great social and maybe even moral sins in this one film in an hour and a half. So she challenges, I guess, the status quo, and I suppose that might be an articulation of how Hamer felt at the time.
It was like when I saw your photograph in the paper this morning. I'd remember every moment we'd ever had together. Oh, Tommy.
Hamer was not a satirist not just a satirist, he was a real filmmaker who got involved with the lives of his characters, and I think we see that reflected in the film.
All right, Mum, I'm up.
I told you before, don't call her Mum.
Well, I've got to call her something. Anyway, Dad likes us to.
There's an interesting question about what genre the film is. It's often described nowadays as a British film noir, but of course people weren't really using the term film noir at this time, or they were just starting to use it in relation to American films, which were usually crime films. And I think there's a sense that the film kind of skews round from being a portrait of Rose and her emotional situation to becoming much more of a crime thriller.
Stolen car.
This is it.
We've got several films going on at once, so that the final sequence is a classic piece of French cinema that happens to be imposed into England. You're using the railway yards around Stratford, but you're using them as if they were in a film by Carnet or one of the French filmmakers of the 30s, or even Fritz Lang. It's a phenomenal sequence in the railway yards.
Breathtaking, that sequence in the marshalling yards. I mean, it's thrill. I'm going cold thinking about it now. I think it's so good.
Is really one of the great action sequences in British cinema. British cinema was very studio bound at this time, and to actually get out on location and to use the real streets and to use the real shunting yards is something that you just don't see very often. It's more common in American cinema at this period. So I think it's a rare moment of getting the feel of being out on location, and it makes for a very exciting ending.
What is fabulous about that ending is not only is it superbly photographed and cut, it's a complete denial of geography. You never know where you are. And even Hollywood couldn't do that better. It's the most wonderful extended sequence. Breathtaking even now. And then to end it with a very sad coda, that Googie Withers' husband will stand by her.
I had to help him.
Don't worry about that now. You go get well quickly. How are we going to get along without you?
I think audiences at the time would have recognised the truth of the ending of the film. Actually, I don't feel it's depressing in the way that many great works of art don't necessarily end up with a happy ever after. What the Googie Withers character realises is that there is a certain comfort in a rather dull, boring relationship, and that the path of passion and excitement which she wanted to pursue in that 24-hour period in her home with John McCallum isn't real, and that you can't live that sort of high-octane life all the time. And maybe for the audience at the time, it's a way of Michael Balkan and Hamish saying, you've had an exciting war, we all need to settle down to get through it, and it's the only way that we'll be able to continue and win the peace, as they used to talk about it.
And it sort of goes back into English domesticity, and as if what it's really saying is we can't have poetry in our lives. We're going to have documentation, we're going to have reality, and the working class lives that we're depicting here will become comedy. They'll be parodied, and that is a kind of slightly depressing ending. And I think audiences may have felt that. They would have liked something more upbeat, but that wouldn't have been true. And the great thing about this story is it's really true to itself. It doesn't sell out at any level.
I don't find it depressing. I find it profoundly realistic. I think it makes sense.
The film has grown in stature enormously over the years. Once upon a time, it was perhaps seen as part of Ealing. Now I think it really stands out as one of the maybe 2 or 3 great achievements, especially because it's not in the genre that we associate most with Ealing today, the wry black comedies.
I think it's one of the few films of that period that feel relevant and real.
I think the film stands up as one of the best English films of its period, and a film that suggests what could have happened in British cinema that never really did. It took a long time to come back to this, because we were going into fantasies of class. We were going into endless reminders of the war, escape movies, flying movies. We were reliving the drama of the war itself, rather than the realities of the post-war world, which were difficult and tight and impoverished.
I think it's been a tremendous film for young filmmakers nowadays to rediscover. People who'd written off British cinema as being, too full of cardboard stereotypes, have found in it a real source of inspiration. If you look at the neo-noir films of the 1980s and 90s that started to be made in Britain, sort of thing that Neil Jordan was making, for instance, I think you can see a kind of return to the inspiration of It Always Rains on Sunday.
In the context of now, we're still living with that idea of community that Haim is trying to talk about. If you look at EastEnders or Coronation Street, they've both got a viaduct over the street or at the end of the square. Rose's story feels very much the sort of story that Pat Phoenix would do in Coronation Street or Kat Slater would do in EastEnders, that you've got a woman challenged in her home in a studio set in the context of lots of other little stories around her. So I think in terms of what we've inherited from it, I think we're still living with it, and I think you couldn't say fairer than that, really, as a way of recognising this film's importance and its relevance to us today.